Hello and welcome to the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast.
I'm Ollie Lumb.
And I'm Mike Castle.
We're here to bring you insights around all of the latest cutting-edge research within coach education and practice.
You can stay up to date with all of our latest episodes through the links in the podcast description below.
We hope you enjoy the episode.
Okay, welcome back everyone. Another episode of the Sport Coaching Podcast. We're coming towards the end of season 5 now. Absolute pleasure to be joined by Dr. Charlie Corsby. Been on a fair few now, so pro, but Emlyn back for only the second time, and it's been a little while since we had you here. So why don't we do a quick reintroduction to you, Emlyn? We'll kick off with you. Remind us a little bit about your journey towards the PhD that we're going to talk about now, and what were your first experiences of coaching? What's sort of taken you along that pathway and led you to where you are now?
Yeah, thanks for having me, Mike. To be fair, unexpected journey of getting here, and especially towards submitting the doctorate 3 weeks ago. But coming from a farming background in West Wales, doing a doctorate was definitely not on the plan or likely outcome back then. Let's put it that way. And I wanted to actually be a physio when I was younger. The A-levels didn't succeed as I wanted to, so therefore I ended up doing Scram. I did the Scram course here for 3 years, and pretty quickly realised that that wasn't a path for me. So at the same time, working doing some coaching within the academy here. I was always obviously involved in football, play football. So then I had the opportunity to do a coaching masters, and that was probably a little bit of a turning point of kind of first time I really started taking coaching seriously, not just practically but academically as well. Picked a few roles within the academy, such as like foundation phase lead, under 19s coach, and Bucks coach with Charles as well. And then during that time, there was an opportunity once I finished the masters to go on a talk doctorate. And then 5 years later, here we are, finally submitting. So yeah, long and probably challenging process at times, but I've been lucky to work with really, really good people. Charles one, obviously Andy was with the other, with the supervised the thesis with Paul Potrak, and then people within the coaching team, and Robin as well specifically has helped me through and guided me to where I am today, really.
Great. So the first thing is congratulations. Well done, submitting your thesis not too long ago. So how's it feeling being, you feeling light as a feather? You feeling a bit more free, should we say?
I'm not sure free is the right word. I felt very content, very happy that I submitted it once the similarity score was approved. But yeah, no, it's a bit of weight off the shoulders, but also knowing there's pressure to either get articles out, to deliver certain things like podcasts, and try and prepare for the Viva. So there's plenty of things to do, but yeah, very, very happy that it's submitted and out the way for now.
Yeah, good. Well, hopefully some of the questions we throw at you today will be somewhat decent preparation for some of the questions you may very well get in the Viva. So I'm sure Charlie will be more than willing to challenge you on a couple of things as well. So looking forward to that. Just before we dive into the paper then, you mentioned Charles there and the influence he's had on your work. Charles, do you mind telling us a little bit of what your role has been as supervisor? What have been some of the good bits and some of the challenging bits about supervising EMS and this particular piece of work?
Yeah, of course. I suppose maybe the first thing that I would say is I don't particularly like the term supervisor. I think it's got a bit of a kind of a hierarchical status to it, and I would definitely say that the way that I've tried to kind of mold my own collaborations is to have work with people, work with a vast number of people in different stages of their careers and their studies, and so I think EMS is a good example of that. We've had a really long history. I think EMS mentioned it there. Played football together for a long time, coached together for a long time too, and worked in different guises and amongst other things. So the thesis itself wasn't kind of a start point or an end point. It's just been kind of an evolving process. But to be a little bit more specific, I think some of the ideas we were kind of talking off the back of the UEFA project. So quite some time ago, Andy, Robin and I did a UEFA project. We had a couple of ideas that came off the back of it, particularly in terms of like coach vulnerability and some of those practices. And having been a coach with Emlyn and working with him, we were obviously kind of perpetuating the same things that I was critiquing in some of the work, or we were trying to find new ways of doing doing things. So how can we break free from some of the constraints that we have? And I think that was probably like the genesis of this particular project. So like I say, long history, but for this particular project, it kind of, I think it would be fair to say some of it comes from our practice and our discussions with those practice, things that we're interested in, working with people, discussions with other people, and it kind of unfolded from there. Because I don't think that the project was super clear from the start either. It wasn't like the door was open and you just need to walk through. Like some projects, I think this has moved quite drastically over the course of the kind of the 5 years of the actual research project itself. And I think that's kind of testament to EMS, but it's also testament to the kind of work that we want to do. That it starts as something and then ends up looking something different, and that's for numerous reasons, but fundamentally around going and collecting data and speaking to people and see what they say. So yeah, I think that's probably the quickest overview.
Good, perfect. It's probably a good point for me to mention that we've done previous podcasts on some of that work that's come out of UEFA on vulnerability, sustainability, etc. So if I can pitch some older episodes to give people maybe some context, that's probably where we direct some of our listeners. So let's get into your work then, Ems. Blurred lines navigating work, home and non-work in the lives of professional football coaches. One imagines what we're going to talk about here is going to be somewhat applicable to coaches outside of football as well. But where was the inspiration, outside of the work that Charlie's mentioned there for the paper? What were the aims and objectives for you? What do you want to get out of it?
I think the inspiration, as Charlie alluded to, was I think a long time, but I say long time, 6 years, 7 years coaching within academy, box, long journeys on a Saturday playing, then going to something on a Sunday, and then the long journeys that we had within box on the Wednesday, we'd go separate. The boys would go in the minibus and we'd be in the car and we're talking about the session that we had on Monday or the game coming up, or where the game's just gone. We're going back and we're talking about it. What can we do next? What didn't we do? What are the issues behind it? How we could improve certain players? So even when we weren't really physically coaching, it was just obsessive with what we do as coaches. How can we improve everyone? And then, what really got us thinking was around, when do we actually stop? And we're from a box coaching experience. It's not a 38 game season, 46 game season. It's 10, 12 games, and then you've got maybe some playoffs or cup games, etc. And we're still in that life, still constantly thinking about coaching. So that's probably where the inspiration came from originally, and some of those ideas. But then specifically kind of led to the aim to explore how coaches make sense of and manage boundaries between the work and non-work, and their everyday lives, and going beyond kind of the surface to really kind of interrogate how coaches describe their kind of day-to-day realities, and how they kind of deal with these pressures and the everydayness of the job. And key objectives were how they navigate the boundaries of work, home and non-work. What kind of boundaries do they encounter? If they do they resist them? How they deal with the pressures, how they balance and prioritize competing agendas, like kind of their own personal goals, professional responsibilities, relationships within organisation landscapes or football clubs, and obviously externally. So in essence, trying to have an understanding of the everydayness of their work, and potentially some elements of non-work if there was any.
Yeah, and Charles, coming back to you a little bit, you mentioned how the project has changed quite considerably over time. Yeah, how long did it take, or what was the process like in just trying to come to even the aims of this work?
Yeah, it's a good question, because similar to what Emlyn was saying there, there's a couple of ideas if you looked across the literature that can kind of map across. So one really clear example is in relation to Hochschild's work. Mm-hmm. So Hochschild's work's been used, I would say a little bit. It's a prominent feature. So there's a couple of good chapters, a couple of good papers, some empirical wrapping around. There's a few more I think on the way, particularly around the gendered nature of emotional work. But as a kind of a general overview, Hochschild's work is limited or predominantly focused within sports coaching research around emotional labour. Mm-hmm. If you actually scan across Hochschild's writings, particularly some of her later work, she writes much more around things like work and non-work, work in life, talks about different shifts as well, second shift, third shift. So there's a couple more kind of conceptual hooks that could be really helpful. And I think originally we were very much going to go down the line of like an emotional piece. So Emlyn mentioned around kind of some of the obsession around it. So what are some of the emotions, the feelings, the embeddedness of that? How does that look in practice? And then as we kind of got into that, though, we were looking at some of maybe Hochschild's work as a bit of a framing tool. There was just something about it that didn't quite speak to Emlyn. Perhaps it didn't quite get going. And I think there was some other aspects that pulled through, perhaps some of the everydayness, even the divisions between work and non-work, and where would that fit. So it was kind of like this ongoing aspect. So it's always been kind of linked there, and we kind of looked at maybe some micro-political literature as well, and thinking about how that might fit together. And use some of these ideas as kind of framing ideas, and where we ended up in the end, and what kind of is captured, and Emlyn will talk about it later, is we just went back to, let's just go back to the practice itself. Let's go back to what people were saying about their practice, rather than really trying to like find something to fit the issue. Let's just go back to what they do and go from there. And so there's the thesis, I think, does a really good job of actually capturing some of that lineage, if you like. But yeah, I think that's probably a really kind of prominent aspect that is in the thesis, but was very much an inspiration of it, and how we ended up with, again, just going back to what people say about what they do.
Yeah, I think it's really insightful just to hear about how you even, how aims are changing right at the start of a project, because people typically see the final version, looks neat and tidy, looks nicely aligned, etc. The narrative is there, but it's a lot of work that even goes into just designing and thinking about what needs to be done. I mentioned at the start of the pod, Charlie, you're a bit of a pro here now. That's a perfect segue as well, mentioning micropolitics and some of Hochschild's work there. In terms of the next question, there's some old favourites in there, I suppose. We've seen some of this work in the literature. But for you, Ems, how important was it for you to root what you were doing in some of that? And probably more importantly, how do you manage that balance between using them to sort of inform some of your ideas, your approaches, versus being sort of really led with them, particularly when you're looking at some of your data maybe later?
Yeah, I think the initial ideas around it probably framed some of the aims and objectives. Was Hochschild's work, different shifts of paid work and unpaid domestic work and emotional work. But obviously we were quite conscious that that's already been done in some capacity within emotional labour. Micropolitics has already been done in some capacity as well. So we just didn't want to kind of repeat what's already been said and go, here's another one.
Yes.
So kind of the original idea was probably to merge some of those ideas together, and how probably micropolitics can inform and probably how we manage certain emotional labours, or how we manage, most importantly, probably the different shifts of work. And therefore, I think that was kind of where the original idea come from, of like the amalgamation of certain ideas and see where we get to. And I think that was quite important. The way that we kind of, as we looked through the data, was around, seeing what is there. And there was some elements of emotional labour, there was some elements of micropolitics, of course, but it wasn't at the forefront of the data itself. So therefore, we kind of didn't go completely away from it. We still informed our understanding of what were the accounts of the coaches, but we then didn't kind of lead, and we certainly didn't finish with that. So yeah, kind of it gave us a good framework to have a kind of a foundational understanding that allowed us then to appreciate and understand the accounts of coaches.
Yeah. And in terms of the kind of the importance or the value of this work, one of the things that you mentioned is, these challenges that coaches are facing at delineating those boundaries between what's work, what's non-work, etc. And suggested maybe that's maybe a result of things like social acceleration, which we'll go into in more detail later. Why do you think these things have been overlooked for such a period of time?
I'm not sure if they've necessarily been overlooked, because I think it's still a common theme within our research, that the work and the constant nature of the work, 24/7 narrative of work, but we're also very mindful not to kind of restate the obvious about the kind of demanding profession. But there's in a way an entrenched belief within coaching that every stone needs to be turned, every detail accounted for, every margin gained. And I think, like I said, other than football coaches, many coaches can relate to that, where they have to do certain things, trying to create certain things, question everything that they do. And this culture of probably constant questioning and scrutiny of our roles, of themselves as coaches, often leaves kind of little room to reflect on where work ends, kind of outside of life, and where outside of life begins. Sorry. So, we talk a lot about reflective practice and reflect on the work that you've done and reflect on the coaching practice, but not necessarily on the everydayness of life. So then kind of obviously these surfaces, and you say it's not necessarily overlooked because there's media examples recently around like Jurgen Klopp leaving Liverpool because he was tired, he had enough, basically it was too much, and the demanding elements of profession. There's lots of coaches that go into roles for 2-3 years and go, that's me done, I've done my project, I'm out. And I think that's related to this kind of overwork culture that we have. And even though there are like systemic issues of social acceleration that we'll talk about a little bit later on, and some of Charlie's work on precarity nature of coaching, they kind of have an element of kind of eroding these boundaries of work and non-work, and that's probably a constant navigation and an issue within coaching.
Right.
I think one of the things that I would add to that as well, really nice explanation, is this is not a new issue either. I think that's one thing I'd be keen to stress. The newness of the project, the originality, if you like, doesn't necessarily lie in not exploring exploring a phenomena that's not been considered before. But actually it's around perhaps reclaiming, reanalyzing, reconsidering some of that issue around the boundaries or work-life balance. Even the idea of work-life balance is problematic. It has like connotations of that something balanced could be achieved, which is something that we've kind of discussed in terms of the broader landscape of literature too. If you look at sports psych as a general, and there's some really good stuff that's in there as well. But much of the kind of the education that we were discussing, so on UEFA A licenses, for instance, you can get a very individual focused solutions. One of the kind of the classic examples is like, you wouldn't let your phone run out of battery. So why would you let yourself run out of battery? So you need to then have some kind of coping strategies or mechanisms in order to make sure that your battery doesn't run really low, which in principle is a good thing. It's a good sentiment. But again, when we're looking to some of these ideas and thinking this didn't necessarily speak to my practicality, sitting in the car with Emlyn for 3 hours on the way down to South England to play a game and just exhausting every avenue of coaching, but having this kind of tension between absolutely loving it, but also knowing that I'm going to finish and I'm probably going to go and write something up later and write, and think of the next session plan and probably text some of the boys and all of the aspects that kind of that wrap around it. And I think that's where some of that kind of call it a dissatisfaction. It's not a dissatisfaction in a criticism at work, but it's a sense of this doesn't necessarily speak to what I'm experiencing either. So we have that kind of piece that's wrapped around some of the things that Emlyn's mentioned there too.
That's great. And you've addressed a lot of these things in the introduction whilst you're sort of reviewing that literature, but the intro itself actually starts with a reflective diary. What was the intention behind that reflective diary? Why did you want to kick off with something like that?
There was several considerations really, and I think it was a bit more personal touch. I think I wanted to offer the reader a glimpse of my own personal journey, and probably highlight some of my biases and where I've kind of have an understanding of where our coaching journeys are also evolved within this work. So there's no way of hiding that. So the elements of like what else do we need to do before a game, the constant navigation, like going to the pub after the training and then leaving. Kind of the narrative talks about leaving the pub and having jobs to do or things to do, whether that was that evening or the next day. So I think it also allowed me to probably position myself kind of within the research, and then talk about the bias and emphasising transparency, reflexivity of my own kind of coaching work, and also I think it aims to create like immediate engagement. Obviously, when you read it, you were okay, I can relate to this. So therefore, I think that helps the reader to try and gauge and go straight into like, what is this work that we're talking around, and I think it allows the reader to really engage with what's actually being done.
Yeah, definitely felt like a nice point of entry for me listening, reading it myself. In fairness, especially when it's a couple of pints of Guinness on the bar, I can very easily read myself into that. We probably should have had a few pints in whilst we were recording this afternoon. In fairness, so getting into some kind of more of the methodology, then how you've gone about doing the work. Just tell me a little bit about the choice of the context here. You've gone for professional football coaches. What was the rationale behind that? Is it because of the link again to some of the work, Charlie, that you've been doing on, vulnerability, the UEFA project, you had access to them, or, is it because that particular sport and coaching in that sport is particularly closely linked to the ideas that you were working with?
We had quite a few conversations about this really around what is the difference really, and we could have gone for same professional coaches, could have maybe compared some. And there's probably some interesting comparisons between the work. But like you suggested, some of the work's already been done within professional coaches, and it wasn't necessarily about access because we've probably got access to full-time professional coaches and also semi-professional coaches. But I think we specifically chose the professional route because they're probably a unique context that they actually operate within. It's like the precarious environments, the short-term contracts, the organisational scrutiny, public accountability that possibly maybe some professional doesn't really necessarily get to those extremes. So focusing on professional coaches like enable a deeper exploration of kind of these dynamic contexts where maybe the consequences of poor results is heightened. So therefore, when we're talking about the pressure of work and non-work and everything around it, that possibly could have provided us better maybe examples or a greater understanding of what they and their everydayness, because maybe some other everydayness of semi-professional coaches might deem to be a little bit different. So hence why we probably went to full-time elements. And I think the football is my interest, so that was kind of where I was led to and what I wanted to do. But like you said earlier, it's not about football coaching, it's around full-time professional coaching in itself. Some of the narratives, of course, are around maybe the next week or the Tuesday night game or the Saturday game. And it's like the constant nature of it, but then you can frame that within any context, really.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that speaks a little bit to that sort of transferability of some of the ideas that are coming out of the work, of course. So, again, for the listeners, once this is up on Figshare or, of course, published later on down the line, don't be put off by the word football in there. This is very, very applicable to all coaches, I think, just professionals generally, I think, even outside of sports. So
I think one thing that I'd also add is one thing that becomes really clear from the project and linked to previous projects as well is professional is not a kind of a homogenous status either. What that looks like in that professional setting was there was quite a lot of difference between respective participants. So one of the things that we spoke about, I think it features in some of the findings too, is around kind of breadth and depth. So depending on the organisations of that professionalisation, sometimes the breadth of their roles were just enormous. So they were very small organisations, not working off huge budgets, and all of a sudden the professional in there, i.e. the coach, head coach, manager, has got an absolute long list of jobs that they get themselves into, but also that they're given and they have to negotiate, which looks very different from perhaps some of the massive organisations where the depth of what you're required to do is, or justify, as we might go on to later, is really clear. But the actual breadth of the job is not so big, and I think some of that fascination comes through with the professionalisation. We were kind of grappling with that as well, and yeah, there's a genuine interest there in terms of what does that look like and how does that play out in terms of how people make sense of their particular settings and what kind of decisions can they and can they not make, or they feel that they can't make. So there's something really purposeful there as well.
So you've got hold of some of these coaches, and you've been interviewing the coaches about their experiences of dealing with this kind of stuff. I thought it was really interesting how you've also asked them to record audio diaries for themselves. I think the reason I found this interesting was because we're talking about sort of almost the busyness, the work, the blurred lines here, and we're kind of asking them almost to do something a little bit extra. Not that doing an interview isn't extra, but did it feel a bit strange asking them to do something extra on top of what is already quite quite difficult for them to manage, quite challenging for that line of work? Did you get any resistance when you were asking them to do those kind of things?
Sounds great on paper, doesn't it?
Yeah.
So we can get them to the audit diaries. And the plan was, originally, was trying to get them engaged with weekly conversations within audit diaries, whether I'd send them a voice note, they'd send something back, and trying to get a little bit closer to them, and certain things or certain examples they may have provided within the audio diaries could inform maybe interviews, or could be informed some of the data moving forward. But like you said, it was difficult. Not necessarily resistance, but just point blank, like just ignoring it. I did carry on with trying to engage with it, and some did, and I might get a bi-weekly one, or might be once a month, and I was very aware of not taking too much of their time. So yeah, of course that was difficult, I guess, from a method perspective, but not necessarily the resistance, and the limited engagement actually added another layer of data itself, because it highlighted exactly what the study was investigating. Firstly, around the lack of time to listen to something, record something. Oh, this has happened this week, and this has happened this week. But secondly, it promoted some of the kind of subsequent interviews, maybe the second interview and a third interview and fourth interview at some spaces, that they started off with, apologies, I haven't been able to engage, been really, really busy, this is happening. So then that speaks for the data itself. So even though I didn't necessarily get as much information and as getting much engagement from those auto diaries as I would have liked originally, and like we said on paper, sounds great. But actually it gave me richer insight and data, the fact that that's what screams at us. We'll talk about a little bit later on around the justification. I cannot do it because of this. So that actually spoke to the data quite well, I thought, even though it wasn't probably implemented in that way.
How do you manage that balance then between sort of trying to be initiatory in terms of like trying to get something from them, maybe little reminder, can you do this for me, versus actually going, do you know what, I'm just going to respect their space, not leave it, sorry, not sort of chase, leave them to it, and maybe accept the fact that maybe I'm not therefore getting access to some of the extra data that I could. How, what was that balance like?
I had a lot of notifications on flash scores, let's put it that way. So I kept a hold of all the results and how they were getting on, and looking at tables and how they were getting on with whether the weekend, Tuesday. So timing, I think, was really important, of when to possibly message them or ask them questions, or what kind of questions to possibly ask. If they were on a bad run, there's no point in me messaging them every Monday morning going, how's this weekend? Tough weekend again. Or, are you worried about your job? That wasn't kind of the plan or how we do this. So I was a little bit careful. I asked, what time's available for you to maybe engage with these conversations when you're have a little bit more time to actually look at your phone. Do you want me to message you in the evening, in the morning, in the afternoon? So it was very much, questioning first, going, what suits you? What happened was none of it suited them. But I did have some engagement and some early on access to them, which again, which was interesting. But I think navigating those order diaries was a difficult task, but also an enjoyable task for myself, knowing that I want to get this data. It's important data to get, and how we kind of navigate that was difficult.
One thing I'd also add as well is we were very conscious that you can claim busyness and you can be really busy. And that's something that I think that implicitly sits in the thesis, and it's a tension that we don't have an answer to, and I don't think the data really gives us an answer to it either. And I don't have a particular position on it, but I was super conscious of not also positioning this project as if you're speaking to people who are untouchable. They're so elite that you can't get hold of them. And I think Emlyn did a really good job of negotiating that balance and thinking about the kind of competence you need as a researcher to manage those relationships and think about when and where to push probe, the kind of reflexive aspects of it. That was key, whilst also valuing the project too, and say this is really important work, and you can have a voice here and you can share some of your experiences. And so whilst we're going to be super respectful, and we always want to be respectful, sometimes that respectfulness needs to be, why are you so busy given the things that you're doing? and asking some of those questions, and that plays out through the data collection without being so direct, of course, but that implicitly is what's informing some of that kind of reflexive execution of the methods.
Yeah, absolutely. I think I found it quite interesting. I know that's not on our interview guide here to ask about, but I was reflecting a little bit on some of the stuff that Harley Simpson was talking about in the episode that we released a few weeks ago about just what it's like entering the fields. Okay, one thing entering the field, it's another thing trying to maintain a level of relationality, relational quality with the people, so you can kind of keep them as part of the project as well. I can sort of only imagine how tricky that can be to land on a decision of, do I send a message here to try and get hold of some data, or do I be a bit more careful here and go, do you know what, maybe it's best I don't, even at the potential risk of not getting hold of some data that might be important.
And I'm completely biased, obviously, with the design of the study, but I think the design of the study was created in that way that we could generate some immersion without necessarily following a design that requires immersion. So immersion is woven into the whole of the design, i.e. they're not just like one-stop episode interviews, drive by, pick up the info and go. And it was thinking about, right, how do these interviews connect together? What are some of the ideas that we want to explore? How do they relate to the aims and objectives? Em's did a really good job of actually mapping that out in the first instance and basically kind of cross-checking, these are some ideas we want to explore, and this comes up, this doesn't come up, whatever it looks like. So there's a connection between interview 1 and interview 4. It's not just like, it's not just this unfolding, like finish, move again, finish, move again. So the way I would describe it is there's an immersion put into it, which I think speaks to some quality. There's some things that we might want to think about in terms of particular methods. And that immersion can be within the particular method, i.e. we're doing an interview, and also between the interviews, and then maybe some supplementary methods too, like the use of the audio diaries, which was again a way of trying to stay in keeping with the different cases of the project without needing something that's kind of a longitudinal immersive project in one particular case, like an ethnography, for instance, for one example.
Yeah, I think on that, I think the immersion is very important, but we also have to remember they do interviews every day. They have to interview, so that was then probably a difficult way to get in to start off with, because you're just getting the media trained kind of responses, which we try to kind of not necessarily eradicate, but also appreciate, but move beyond what they're trying to say. And then quite early on, I think after a couple of interviews, I went, wow, I need more. So I've just explicitly told them before the interviews, I'm going to be quite critical of your practice here. It's not a way of trying to hammer what you do and how you work and whatever. But I just need to be critical of you, so then I can see some responses, and I'm going to question why you do certain things and what you do for X, Y, and Z. So, and to be fair, I think that was really beneficial in the data, because I think they appreciated that, going, all right, okay, fine. I was quite explicit. It's not going to necessarily go anywhere. I'm not trying to get something as a journalist, which is completely different to what we try to do. But it's critiquing what they do with the everydayness of work. And some coaches were very open to that and appreciated that. Some coaches still probably just went, nah, I'd rather just give the media day interview. But yeah, trying to go beyond that, was difficult, but it was something that we spoke about quite regularly, about how do we get beyond those kind of media trained replies.
Final sort of question on methods, which is actually a little bit more to do with just how you've presented your data. You've gone for 2 results chapters as opposed to sort of traditional results and discussion built into one, etc. For lack of a more nuanced question, why?
We actually, Charles provided the idea of actually putting it or structuring the work as 2 separate articles to start off with, which actually helped me get into gear and move the work along, because I thought it was a little bit easier to do that. So whether it was a plan or not, John, I'm not too sure, but it got me going within the work. But we then decided to put it into 2 separate results sections. And kind of the first result section in relation to justification work takes inspiration from some of like ethnomethodological approach, explicitly, like focusing explicitly on the detailed accounts of what coaches provided, and how coaches themselves described, rationalised, and made sense of their roles, and how they consistently justified what they did. It wasn't the fact I was looking for it. It was kind of I was slapped in the face with it, because I was going to interviews and they were just justifying everything, justifying what they did, how they did certain things. And the example of the audio diaries earlier is the perfect example of, I didn't even ask, I just asked them the audio diaries, come to me, how are you? Oh yeah, sorry. So straight away, I've been doing this, so that way of holding accounts and explanations of the work. So that was the one element of the results section, which probably analysed some of the data a little bit differently. And then the second chapter, or the second section of results, was around kind of boundary work, which took a little bit more of a traditional approach, where we explore the consequences that arise from probably some of the justifications and the explanations of this constant kind of 24/7, nature of coaching that they faced kind of within kind of professional lives and personal lives. So it's probably in the way we analysed and saw the data, because some of the data overlap within kind of the justification results section and the boundary work section, and the data is the same, but the way we analysed it and saw the data was a little bit differently.
Yeah, I think the first section I find absolutely fascinating. I think it's probably a common thread through some of the work that I've done, but essentially the ethno methods idea, it means that nothing's untouched, everything's up for grabs essentially. So rather than treating interview as a way of generating, constructing data, it treats the interview as a practice itself, as a production of social order in and of itself. And so that's where, through the kind of the ongoing nature of what Emlyn was doing, when we were trying to have kind of more traditional data analysis sessions, to use a phrase, we were slapped in the face by the just constant justification. And the justification was the production of the social order. This was a key thing that was allowing the coaches to get done their explanation, their accounts, and the ways in which they were talking about their practice. It was just an ongoing justification of doing or not doing things, as the case may be. And it's just such a fascinating way of kind of taking on a phenomena that we didn't necessarily intend to do that in the first place. This certainly wasn't a study that was designed in that way, or thinking with ethno-methodological sensibility in the first place. But actually, as a result of doing the practice, it was like, right, well, we need to pay attention to what we're doing here. We can't just take this and run with it, which is where the split of the original idea of splitting the papers comes in, and actually it really helped us give some clarity in terms of how they might connect, because the justification work is a part of the boundary work and is a part of some of the kind of more referential analysis that's in there. But it's just such a fascinating project to be involved in because of the kind of the manifestation of it, and we've tried our best to actually put that in and demonstrate it in the thesis, which I think is pretty rare.
Yeah. Does that I suppose you've kind of half answered a question for me there. The splitting of the results, is that because you see this maybe later on down the line when you're looking for publication, that this is two projects sort of wedged into one that needs splitting, or are you thinking that actually these need to come back together in some way to get it into one?
I think the original idea when I posed it to Emlyn was very pragmatic, functional idea. To help Ems write it up. We kind of knew the ideas were there, but it was how can we basically get this going? How can we get this into a thesis? And I actually plagiarized the idea off Mike Stenbridge. So he asked me the question: why do you write monographs? Why do you put it all together? Why not create papers and just have your thesis as the papers? To which I kind of fumbled through an answer, and I thought actually, and the fumbling through answer was something to do with breadth and depth. But then I was thinking, actually, there's something in here that we're claiming to kind of analysis as we go through. And so the idea was then actually, well, why not let's write it as two papers? And it would have been a very pragmatic decision as well towards publication, maybe quicker to be able to submit to a journal. Ironically, it didn't work out that way. Actually, we went back to a bit more of the tried and tested. But the thesis the structure does reflect a kind of the different flavors of the analysis. And I wouldn't say that they're two different analyses. Not like we've taken the data set and done two different things with it, but they do have very different focuses. And what is classed as the data in the first section is much more on the actual production of that scene, i.e. the interviews and the audio diaries, whereas the second bit, we look at what's been said here, like the referential aspects. And so they actually then fit together quite nicely. But yeah, that was the kind of the long and short of it.
I suppose just for clarity, those listening, as Em's mentioned at the start, because this is the taught doctorate programme, that thesis is a lot smaller than the traditional PhD. Some people might be thinking, well, a traditional PhD is sort of multiple papers, multiple publications, as it were. The DSc thesis is closer to 30,000 words, so a little bit trickier, I suppose, to maybe conceptualise it as being multiple papers.
Yeah, I think it's a good point. Size in the DSc is a consideration for sure. If you split the thesis, I'm a big fan of if you just split the thesis in a more traditional sense, you're going to essentially run the risk of shooting yourself in the foot because you don't give yourself the room for the depth and breadth that we referred to earlier. And so thinking of like more innovative ways of capturing that. For me, that's where you ask a question around the story at the beginning. That's where it comes in. So I can demonstrate my reflexivity through laying out my biases in a 2-page story at the start in a DSc thesis that can set up that conversation around reflexivity without necessarily having to provide a 6,000 word review of reflexivity. So you can lay things out for the reader that demonstrates your research nuance without necessarily having to be so explicit with it. PhD, and naturally you've got more room, so you can and you should take more time to do it. This is where the DSc becomes, the thesis element of it becomes really difficult. It becomes really, really difficult. You'd think that actually having a smaller wordage would be the easier thing to do, and it doesn't play out like that. And that's kind of where the conversation comes in. It's like preserving quality without and being innovative with it without necessarily just copying a bit smaller version.
Yeah, absolutely. It's quite similar to when we had Mara in the studio and Charlie, you talking about that language paper, which was part of a special issue, smaller paper. Everyone thinks, oh, maybe that's a little bit easier, perhaps a little bit more liberating, but actually more challenging because you've really got to get into the message quick and be pretty sharp with it. We've been going for about 40 minutes now, and we haven't even touched results yet. I've been so interested in just the way you've gone about doing this work. So let's get into the results. Those two chapters, they're split. So we've got justification work and then we've got boundary work. So let's start with the justification work. And you've broken that down into sort of 3 subsets. We've got everyday justifications, professional justifications, and then the justifications of self and others. So can you tell us a little bit about each of those?
Yeah, so the first one around everyday justifications, captured daily, probably habitual explanations coaches provided for the relentless kind of demand of the roles, essentially about how coaches rationalised ongoing like availability and always being available, constant busyness that Charles talked about, and the inevitable merging of professional kind of responsibilities into everyday personal routines. For instance, coaching frequently explained kind of workload and lifestyle is just the nature of coaching. It just is what it is, or something they felt simply they just had to accept. Second then was around the professional justifications, where coaches actually sought to kind of validate and defend their role or justify why they're doing what they're doing within their practice and within professional gatekeepers or other coaches and colleagues with that around it, or maybe owners, chair people, etc. So how they continue to negotiated kind of some of their professional legitimacy, might be the right word, around like how can they stay in the job. And then we also explored the justification of self and others, and this was kind of perhaps more about introspective into themselves, focus on how coaches justified their own actions and sacrifices to themselves, as well as possibly significant others away from work, such as like family, close friends. So coaches frequently express kind of the sacrifices they made, kind of missing important elements. Family comes second, and these are the conversations they discussed and try to justify their own practice and why they do certain things to have an effect on others. And it's just it's them justifying to themselves what they do and how they do things.
Is there like any sort of nuanced difference here, or kind of intention behind using the word justifications? Does it come from the previous literature, or is it, was that very intentional choice of words rather than using something like trying to rationalise something to oneself, or even make excuses for why things have or haven't happened?
I think that's a fair question. I don't necessarily think we considered maybe alternative words, but it was very much, I feel like it's quite a defensive word, and they were defending what they are doing. So therefore, they're trying to justify their own practice to do certain things and why they were doing certain things. So it's very much, defending what they do and how they do things. And I think that was where kind of justifications come from, rather than an alternate word, I think.
Yeah, I think to add into that as well, one thing that really strikes me with what Emlyn's just explained there is the kind of differences between those justifications. The justification itself was super interesting, explaining why you might do certain things, like I'm going to go to the office at 7 a.m. and I'm going to leave at 9 p.m. Because I need to do A, B, and C. I need to show that I'm there, some of the like presenteeism. But then, which is one is one aspect, but also one thing that kind of kept coming through was, and this is where I think it leans towards justification, is how that was a feature of the requirements of their job too. So the chairman comes in and wants to know what you've been up to. So they're constantly on this kind of like, well, I'm doing this, and this, justifying what it is, or they have a particular issue, they need more finances, they have to go and then really provide a case and justify what that looks like. So yeah, it kind of felt like a really key term that kind of encapsulates some of the different nuances that you've mentioned there, like rationalizing, excusing. There's something that's kind of layered to that as well, which is quite prominent throughout the data set.
Yeah, absolutely. Almost like, to me, when it's sort of reading through some of it, almost it kind of draws up this idea that it's always a justification as a bit of like a battle of, okay, well, I'm doing it, like trying to defend oneself against, why are you asking me that? Why are you asking me while I'm still in the office at 9 p.m. or why I'm going in so early, etc. It always seems, like you say, defensive.
So we've got a paper, it's published, when was it published? 2022, I think, Coaching the Act of Self-Repair. And there's some similarities in the idea there. I think this takes it off in a new direction, and it brings in a whole different population. But there's something that was a feature of that paper that I think also helps explain what we're doing here, which is the prospective nature of these justifications. They're retrospectively justifying why you did something, and for that paper is repairing an account of what actually happened. But in doing that, there's something very prospective. There's something future orientated towards it. So if I can justify to you now why I'm doing something, it means that maybe later on you might not come and ask me what's going on. So there's some like future orientated to it, and that's where the coaches were kind of wrestling between that. I'm gonna justify that I'm the hardest working person in the room, because if you sack me tomorrow, if the team loses, then my stock is going to be preserved, and therefore I might find another job, which is some of the kind of connection to some of the latter findings too. But that comes out in a very production of order aspect, which links to the self-repair stuff too, which I think is a nice kind of extension of some of those ideas.
Some of the data that you've then presented within this section, definitely for me reading it, is fairly hard hitting, even smaller quotes. So one of them in there is, coaches speaking about perhaps what people are saying to them about the lack of time that they have about engaging in social and personal activities, or why you're not coming out for dinner, etc. And they're justifying, I've got to do this, I've got to do that. And that's adding a lot more pressure to the work. And one of the quotes is, they just don't get it, which I felt like saying myself a fair few times, in fairness, when I've been talking about why I'm going in extra early or coming home extra late, etc. That to me is sort of evidence of the coaches very much getting past those media responses that you were typically getting, actually telling you how they really feel. So you're becoming sort of like a holder of some of that more sensitive data, as it were. How did you how did you find handling that relatively sensitive data? How did you select the most appropriate bits, or even choose not to select some of the bits that you could have put in?
Yeah, I think we were pretty wary throughout of there's quite a lot of sensitive data within the interviews, and I think we did really get past within the latter stage of the second interview and third interview, really get past the media type interview. And I think what we were very careful of was not over criticizing how they work, but just trying to appreciate and understand what they do to work. And I think within the data, there was elements of some examples around like family comes second, and some elements of they just, like say, they just don't get it, and I'm putting food on the table for them. The family, they wouldn't be in a situation where they are in if it wasn't for me. So there's elements of that data that we were careful of choosing and putting it within the work, and there was further other elements you're like, okay, well, that doesn't need to be added, because I think the point has already been made. So yeah, we also went back to the participants to go like, this is the data, like an overview of the results section. This is the data we've used. This is the certain examples. More of a member reflection to make sure that they were okay with how they were represented. So yeah, it's something that we were pretty conscious with, but it's also something that we can relate to. And we can probably understand, like you're saying, they just don't get it. So you after reading that, oh yeah, I do this. Yeah, they just don't get it, because you've got to be out and your own coaching experiences. So that we could relate to some of the examples that they used. So it wasn't necessarily such a shock. So it wasn't something that we were fearful of either.
Yeah, good. And we won't go into too much of the data. Just this isn't a paper that's been published just yet, and we'll make sure we add a link to it a little bit later onto the podcast description. But I think if we had a lot more of it, I wouldn't share too much of it, because I want people to go and read it. And I think actually the data that you've picked out is very relatable. Again, coming back to that early conversation in the podcast, it might be football coaches, but very, very easy to read myself into some of the stuff that's there, which I think is really important for a piece of work like this. The next chapter then is more that focus on boundary work. So those blurred boundaries between their professional, personal lives. And again, that's split into three. So let's start with the first, which is this demand for constant availability. What did you mean by that, and what was it that you observed in the work?
I think it stemmed from obviously the earlier section around justification and the constant need to do this. And yeah, this section around demand for constant availability is the expectation that coaches need to be accessible, responsive, essentially like the old on-call for work-related tasks. And most of it's probably outside traditional working hours. So observe some of the probably the coaching culture that they all constantly said, I'm always available, I can do this, yeah, I'll always provide my players with a certain number that's always like on, with other examples that I can be contacted whenever if I'm not in work. And there's also actually a video of the new Plymouth Argyle manager as well, recently come out on social media, and even he says, I think it was all over social media, about his opening conversation with the players, and even he talks around I'm always available whenever you need, let me know. So like even that's currently out there. It's not really even, that's nothing, obviously nothing to do with the data. So, and that's celebrated. So I think that's what was really interesting there, was around, they felt the need to be constantly available, because they are the social norms of the job. And I think that's where kind of that data really, and that section really comes from and talks to.
Again, something really easy to think about, just the nature of our roles here at the university. If you need to speak to me, then just grab me in the cafe, or I've got open door, pop on by, come and ask me, etc. What do you think? I know you talk about some of the social norms, etc. I feel like I'm experiencing that a lot more in work now than perhaps I used to. Where do you think that's coming from? Why is that becoming more of a social norm versus perhaps, I don't remember experiencing too much of that. Not saying it didn't happen, but it feels a bit more obvious, feels a bit more overt to me nowadays. Why do you think that's developed?
Yeah, I think that links to some of the work we'll probably talk a little bit later on around kind of social acceleration of Rose's work. But there's some examples around, and the next session talks about a little bit more about precarity of the job, the worry of losing the job and having to prove themselves. And, the Plymouth Argyle example, that's there to be seen, is very much player orientated. But there's also, you've got to justify your job and hold yourself in the job. So therefore, you need to be constantly available to owners, and many of the owners are not necessarily based in the UK. So therefore, you need to be around and available literally 24/7. So if someone from America or Asia calls you, then you need to be available at that period of time because they're paying your wages. So that's where that probably the conversation where they talk to, where I need to be able to stay in this job. Of course, I need to be available, not just for players to improve them, tactical, etc., but it's the wider organisational issues. There's elements of there was some examples of they needed to do the paint the change room, and the painters needed to ask the manager what colour he wanted the change room to be, and he's like, I don't care. But that's the element of needing to be available for everyone at all times, and yeah, that's probably where it speaks to. Yeah,
and you've mentioned there some of the precarity. That's the next section of that particular chapter. Obviously, some relevance here to some of Charlie's work. What kinds of precarity were the coaches speaking of? How did that have an impact on their coaching and indeed their approach to that split of work and non-work?
Yeah, I don't think we talk about there isn't a split, and some of Charlie's work around precarity is around vulnerability, unstable, insecure, and it's specifically around probably the short-term contracts, or I think the average tenure that we spoke about in the thesis is around 13 months. I think that's the average for coaches to stay in the job. So the job insecurity or security is an issue. The constant pressure to perform and achieve, a lot of the words are success. We need to get immediate success to be able to stay in the job, or maybe to hold stock, as Char referred to earlier, as, okay, well, I need success. I need the player of the coach of the month, or I need to do really well to stay up. So therefore my stock increases. So whenever there needs to be an emergency coach to go elsewhere, I'm available. So, and this is the nature of trying to protect themselves. And this is what that section really talks to and talks about. And how they kind of influence like the day-to-day practices and perceptions of then boundaries between professional and personal lives. So because they're fully aware that it's a precarious job, they were like, well, it's the nature of the job. I might lose it, I might stay in it, I might go somewhere. It is what it is. So therefore they're fully aware for it. So therefore they feel like they have to fully immerse themselves in the job and be 24/7, and there is no boundaries and nothing else exists outside of this. So then that speaks to the rest of the work around the boundaryless nature due to the precarity of it.
Is some of that kind of like an example of justifying just that's what it's like being a football coach, being a professional football coach, and then sort of almost perpetuating those issues then in and of itself? It's like just accepting, well, not to be defeatist necessarily, but it's just what it is. So that's going to carry on, and I just have to live in it.
Yeah. One of the things that we mentioned, and we still have this conversation now, is, and this attention I think that comes through with this kind of work more generally, but Emlyn's work really captures it, is what's the alternative then? Like, how would you reimagine this? So I've asked them all the time, how would you reimagine this? Like, if you could just like tear it down and rebuild it, what would it look like? And there's a real tension there in terms of what you're saying around the coaches kind of giving over to it, and the examples and the justification work really captures that. They just give over to it, and therefore they're consumed by the justificationary practices, and therefore they go and just reproduce them. And then thinking through, well, yeah, this is how it is. So you either get on board or you get off as such. That really comes through, and I suppose we would argue that there's some real room for some education in there, and it's not to go back to the previous point. It's not to put some kind of band-aids on some pretty kind of open wounds, or it's to think carefully about how you might kind of start to shift and make things more meaningful in certain instances. So the the precarity is a good example. The likelihood that we're going to be able to start to increase contract times is a difficult tanker to turn around. But to start to think about, well, how do you make your time in that position more meaningful? What are the things that you're going to really value? How are you going to justify some of those? Like, what becomes meaningful as a result of that? What are the things that make you come back and allow you to be sustainable, and the sustainability aspects come through? They're kind of key aspects that are begin to be highlighted. And yeah, I think it's not to then kind of, the solution is not just to offer the opposite, like we'll have not, complete job security, for instance, because there's something that comes through here as well, that there is a sense that these people like it too. Definitely. So it's important not to kind of over exaggerate this, but what the actual social analysis does is it shows how this plays out. It shows how it plays out on the phone, driving home in the car. It shows the kind of the really everyday aspects of to kind of skip to the next section, the quote, arse in the chair but head elsewhere. Like, that shows like this is what actually happens when you sit down, or going taking the dog for a walk is a frequent one, and thinking about other things. Like, there's some real practice there you can really like tune into and ask some really meaningful educational questions around, and help people to kind of reclaim some of their agency here and be purposeful with that. And if they still choose to do it that way, then fine. But there's some real enlightening things there that I think can be pulled out, without needing to just kind of recommend very kind of individualistic solutions. I could think of loads of different examples that I'm not going to say.
And we'll talk about that next session in just a moment. But one particular part of your thesis notes how one of the participants actually lost their job during the process of data collection. How did that impact the way that you went about doing the research, particularly with that individual? What kind of issues did that cause for you?
Yeah, I think it was difficult. I think out of the seven coaches, the 7 participants, I think 4 of them experienced significant kind of changes within the circumstances. I think 2 participants actually lost their jobs during the data collection, which kind of tells a story in itself. So then, naturally, I was a little bit wary, going, "Oh, they're just not going to bother anymore. They'll just leave it alone. They're not coaching. They don't care. Like, oh, they've got other things to worry about." So I was really, really worried that we were going to step away, but thankfully, I'm like extremely grateful that they didn't. Both of them carried on and chose not to withdraw from the research. And actually, even though these experiences were quite difficult and quite difficult to question and ask and possibly critique, it adds again to the nature of coaching with it. And even though they're not even in a job, it's still boundaryless, because they've got to write a CV. They're generally still working hard. They need to position themselves for the next role. Their stock needs to be high. They need to maybe do some radio work, TV work to get them to visibility, for example. So their continued kind of involvement in the job or in the role or in coaching highlighted exactly what we're talking about, and exactly the boundaryless and precarious realities of the research we're trying to explore. And it talks to some of what Charlie said about maybe they like it. Maybe it's not something that we possibly want to change. Maybe that is the nature of it, and that's what they want to do, and that's how they want to work. So they're just constant navigation of the next one, and even when they're currently in a job, they're always preparing for the next job. So they already know they're going to get sacked at some point, or leave at some point, or another opportunity comes up. So yeah, I was really thankful and grateful for the coaches to still engage within the research project, because that could have been an issue. But certainly they involved themselves in the research, and they gave us further data to highlight some of the issues that we're talking about here.
And that final section then is, as Charles already mentioned, arse in the chair, head elsewhere. It's probably my favourite subheading in the thesis. In there you're referring back to the idea of switching off or not, as the case may be. So, can you tell us a little bit about what the coaches were experiencing there? Yeah,
it probably captures what a lot of the quote captures what the coaches were really talking about. And it's a little bit obvious when you just sat there and within the conversation, you're not necessarily there, not involved. So with themselves, they're occupied by external things, maybe such as obviously the job itself, rather than kind of family. In this instance, was a family interaction where they just weren't there. They weren't in conversations, and the coaches spoke a lot about the difficulty of switching off, even when they try to disengage from work, from some of the maybe walking the dog, going to the gym, on holiday, wherever it may be, and really unable to kind of detach themselves from kind of demands of coaching, which, as already alludes to, of why they don't detach themselves. So the inability to switch off wasn't simply about kind of external demands placed on them by their clubs or their national governing body or the organisation or other colleagues. It was just kind of deeply internalised by who they are, and they just said, well, this is how I work and this is the way it is. So they regularly acknowledged the importance of kind of rest and time away, but they didn't do it. So it's, I know I need to take a break, and when I walk the dog, it's important for me to try and stay away and think about something different. But you don't. Like and that was where probably some of the critique came from within the interviews, but not necessarily resistance. They were quite aware of it when you talk to them about it, but they were like, I need time, I need to do this, but they don't act what they what they say they talk around. Probably some of the issues that Charles talks around of some of the research that's currently out there, that maybe they're trying to implicate something to maybe improve their ability to detach themselves from work, which then, as seen in this work, doesn't necessarily work. So we probably need to find other ways to do that.
There's quite a profound irony in what we're talking about as well, in that the coaches were, I say the coaches in terms of the data, but really you could read that as in myself in here, or Emlyn, whoever. But for coaching, we are quite happy to say it's about people work, it's about relations, it's about communication, lots of kind of the key aspects that we might pull out of the coaching literature more generally, irrespective of where you look at it. It's about working with people and kind of giving yourself over to it, care being a really good example, and being open to some of those demands and those relations of coaching. Yet what kind of the irony of it is that the same principle is not then applied to their relations, their familial relations, or key characters within their lives. And I think that was something that's really quite profound in terms of the data, the kind of the coaching trumped everything else. And reimagining that, as we spoke about earlier, becomes really difficult to reimagine, because you can't just go, well, don't put coaching first, because you can realize yourself through coaching. It's a job that allows you to learn something, to be something. But understanding that irony, I think the thesis really captures that, and I think that's such an important point that I would kind of pull out, and I think Ems has expressed that really well.
Were there any points where you've drawn their attention to that sort of almost hypocrisy, if you like? You've made them more consciously aware of it through your critique. You're saying this, but you're not actually doing it. Did that then influence any change in them? Did you notice that they changed things as a result of just engaging with your interviews and that sort of critical lens you provided?
I would say I had a fair few comments post interviews around, that really helped, and I felt like I got a lot off my chest, and you critiquing somehow, so I'm going to try and implement it. And then with the next interview, how's the things going, and how's kind of coaching life, and how's the boundary going? Yeah, it's all gone out the window. So it's really, really difficult to then trying to, I think there is some appreciation when you are telling them, and when you're in conversations with them, they are involved, and they're probably aware of some of the issues that we're talking around. What they want is a how-to guide, which doesn't exist within our work. And they want, yes, go do that and off you go. But my point was to them was that we can't do that. You have to kind of live it. You have to be able to understand what we're trying to talk about and trying to move that within your practice and within your life. And I think, even though they had an appreciation of it and an understanding of it, I'm not too sure they didn't necessarily influence their practice, let's put it that way.
Yeah. And so moving into the discussions then, we then start, it's mentioned earlier on in the thesis, of course, but you lean a little bit more here on some of Rosa's work and resonance and social acceleration. What was the value of bringing that work into this particular project, and where were you first drawn to those ideas?
Yeah, actually, the idea of Rosa's work initially came from a conversation I had with Christian Bjorndal after the cricket presentation in Northumbria last year. I was presenting some of the kind of early findings and some of the ideas that I had. He approached me straight after the thing, after the presentation. I was have a look at Rosa's work, and maybe some that would be a useful way to move forward with your practice. So I was like, okay, never heard of him. Let's have a look. All right. So then started reading some of Rosa's work and his ideas around social acceleration. Kind of immediately made kind of sense to some of the work, but also in relation to my own social practice. And then when, the experiences of coaches, in particular what they were describing, was in line with some of this acceleration work. So, basically Rosa suggests around that social acceleration refers to the way modern life keeps kind of speeding up, more demands, more expectations, and the constant pressure to keep moving forward. So everything needs to be done faster, better, more efficiently. And this acceleration leads to individuals feeling maybe slightly alienated or disconnected from their own lives, their work, relationships, for example, within the coaching sessions setting. So that kind of that's where the original idea come from, of accelerating life and accelerating work, which speaks to the coaches. But what really intrigued me was Rosa's kind of idea then of resonance as a potential response or antidote to this kind of acceleration, where resonance, according to Rosa, refers to genuinely meaningful connections to your work, to your environment, to relationships, or within being. And basically moments we talked about kind of interactions that give you a deeper sense of fulfillment and connection. So in the context of the doctorate, when you're talking about arson share headers elsewhere, there is no resonance in that moment of the conversation that they're having with family or away, and it's trying to not necessarily find, but being open for resonance, because it's not something that you can go and try and get. You can't get resonance. It's not something that you try and pick up and go, I'm going to do this to get resonance of something. It's something around being within life and trying to, for maybe a better phrase, maybe being present with individuals or within the interactions, whether that is within work or whether that's in non-work. And that's some of the ideas that the Rosa really brings out. Is it's not necessarily right. Well, there is boundaries, and you have to create a boundary. It's not that. It's around kind of resonating and being present within the social being of world, wherever you are, whether you are in work or whether you're in a home, whether you're in the car. It's being kind of within the world and being having resonance with those you have interactions with, and not necessarily like individuals. It could be objects, subjects as well.
One of the things that really extends and helps connect to is within some of the work that we've done with sustainability. One of the questions we ask is, why do you coach? And as a result of asking that question, there is a kind of one of the conclusions that we make is there's a kind of a sweet anxiety to coaching, this kind of like real sense of meaningfulness that you can get, and turning to some kind of phenomenological ideas, that sweet anxiety comes from having a sensitivity to relations in the world around you. And what Rosa then does is actually helps us then make that connection again. So starting to build the bridge to, right, well, how would you reimagine? So it's not a case of getting rid of some of that precarity, because it's going to be really hard to do. In an ideal world, idealistically, okay, but actually ways that we might cope with some of that, the social acceleration that Emlyn's mentioned, is through the sweet anxiety of the coaching practice itself. And resonance helps us actually have a language and a way of speaking that might really speak to people. It speaks to my own world and relations within those world, and trying to be sensitive to some of those and understand what is meaningful and what's not so meaningful, and making like careful decisions off that. And it gives you what I think Rosa might describe as a residence, or you're working towards that, whilst not losing some of that sweet anxiety too.
So to start wrapping things up then, what are sort of the overriding messages that you would like coaches, scholars to take from your work?
The classic question of, what's the point really, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
I guess originally I think my main intention was to simply get coaches to appreciate some of the unseen aspects of coaching work, and how they internalize these kind of demanding expectations and seeing beyond that. But most importantly, I think building from some of the element of resonance and some of the element of Rose's work, to encourage and to think about coaching not just in terms of relentless productivity or performance or success, but in terms of genuine kind of meaningful engagement, feeling connected to what you're doing and who you're doing it with. So for some of the examples that we're talking about, when you're walking a dog, you are walking the dog, you are with the dog, you are with kind of wherever you are walking. So that's an element of not necessarily escapism, but it's more an element of being there and appreciating where you are. And then when you are in work, you are in work and you're within resonance within that. And when you're with family, you're with family. So I think these are the elements and ideas that we're trying to probably portray and trying to move forward, and get coaches to grasp and understand how that can maybe make a more meaningful way to make it a little bit more of a sustainable practice, because the elements that we're talking around is kind of burnout, short-term contract, precarity, insecurity, worry, and therefore they cannot do it anymore. There's some elements where coaches decide to leave the role as well. So I really think that idea of resonance from Rose's work can really relate to a lot of the coaches to be able to make it a little bit more sustainable.
Perfect. So next up, Viva. How are you feeling ahead of that, and following that successfully, of course? Where are you going next? Where does this work take you?
Well, waiting for a confirmed date for the Viva itself to start off with. But yeah, I think with myself, like podcasts like this, we've got hopefully some articles which it's certainly a difficulty of mine at the moment to try and write that into articles. I thought it would be a little bit easier than it is. Wider reading, and just discussion with other colleagues around the work. I think it keeps me in it, because I know if I'm not in it, then it's really, really hard to step back in. So I think that's certainly something that I'm trying to do before we get the Viva date. We've already got two. Obviously, Robin, he selected himself for the mock Viva, and Gareth as well, who at the moment are questioning me when I walk around bench or when I walk around campus around certain things, which is positive, and it enables me to think about the work. So I think once that's out the way and prepping for the Viva and currently within it, I think the plan really is to get some good articles out there of some quality. I think there's definitely two elements of justification and boundaryless, and how we kind of separate them in certain ways to try and get two quality articles out there. And from then, we Andy, Charlie and I, we're currently speaking with individuals within different organisations, with national governing bodies, of how can we really have this impact on disseminating some of this information and making it have an influence on coaching practice. And like you said, it's not necessarily within football. Football doesn't matter, because I don't think there are many examples within the thesis that are based on football. It's just within the everydayness of coaching. So hopefully this can have an influence and effect, and hopefully it can resonate, funny enough, with a lot of the coaches, that they can appreciate some of the work that we're talking about.
Okay, plenty to do. I know that some of actually the opening of your thesis is written in Welsh, so pob luck gyda arholiad.
Diolch yn fawr.
Hope it goes well. Good luck with the exam. We'll finish in our usual way. Myths about sport coaching. You've had a long time to prepare for this, in fairness, Em, so expecting a good one here. Before we finish, any myths from sport coaching, relevant or not to what we've spoken about today, that you just want to speak to before we close?
I think it speaks to the work a little bit. It's just the having to be in at 7 o'clock in the morning and leave at 10. I think that's certainly a myth that we're trying to get away from. It's really about what you're doing, Because if you're in at 7 o'clock in the morning and you're leaving at 7 o'clock at night in 12 hours within you, what are you actually doing in that time? It's the argument that Charles talks about being busy, but busy doing what? So it's really questioning that, and I think maybe that could possibly maybe a little bit cutting question for coaches to go, well, I am busy and I am doing loads of work and it's it's critiquing them at times, but it's also appreciating and getting them to understand. Okay, let's have a look at what I'm doing. I could probably do that in an hour, but instead I'm walking around doing this, and it's important for me to do this. And it's just necessarily how we would probably describe it as wasting a lot of your time. So that's probably one of the myths that we're trying to eradicate within this work, and how can we trying to be a little bit more productive, I guess. Yeah,
well, fingers crossed, doing a podcast for an hour and a half is more productive than it is making you busy, mate. That's
I hope so.
Hopefully you found it helpful, and no doubt our listeners are going to find it helpful. Really appreciate you sharing your thesis with us. Again, best of luck with the exam, Charles. Thanks for coming in as well. Really appreciate your time. Big thanks also to our sport broadcast team for all of their continued support. Our students are absolutely amazing at helping us out with all of the recordings, and thanks to everyone who's listening in as well. We'll be back with another episode very soon. Until then, subscribe to the podcast, leave us a rating, and we'll see you all next time.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Cardiff Met Sports Coaching Hub podcast.
If you enjoyed the episode, leave us a rating and a review on your favourite podcast platform. If you're watching on YouTube, like and subscribe.
If you want to stay up to date with all of the latest work coming out of the Coaching Hub, please follow us on social media. All the relevant links are in the description.
And if you'd like to be featured in an upcoming listener special episode, drop us your questions to coachinghub@cardiffmet.ec.uk.